Allow me to present Lucinda Murley from Delta E, based in Scotland. Lucy is the lead analyst on the flexibility and storage teams in Delta E, working across a wide range of topics, including business model propositions, competitor landscapes, and the development of demand-side flexibility. Lucinda brings expertise in transitioning towards subsidy-free local energy systems. She supports research delivery by conducting primary and secondary research with a wide range of industry stakeholders. Welcome, Lucy. Can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can hear you, and thank you very much for having me today. I look forward to it.
Excellent. Anything you would like to add to your introduction?
Yeah, I might be worth adding that demand-side flexibility is a key topic. I'm really sort of happy that different parts of the world are engaging with it. It's sort of a buzzword in Europe at the moment, but it's lovely to see that other parts of the world are sort of helping and entering this transition towards sort of a decarbonised global energy system. So that's something that's really positive from my perspective.
Excellent, excellent. We're very, very happy to have you, Lucy. Before we begin, let me share some statistics from our audience today. We're hosting a very international session. 84% of our audience is based in Mexico, but 6% from the deep connects from the United States. We have a 4% from Spain, as well as many other Latin American countries. Welcome, everyone. In terms of their organizational role, 48% is upper management, which is comprised of different positions like CEOs, CFOs, and business owners. And then we have a 30% who hold a technical position like engineers, project managers, energy managers, application engineers. We have 11% from the commercial side, sales engineers and business consultants. And finally, based on their company's profile, 59% is based on SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses. 18% are based in multinational corporations. 7% are based in academia. And actually, there are many research positions who join us today. And we do have presence from government officials, media, and NGOs. So let us begin, since this is a somewhat novel and sometimes misunderstood concept. For this first portion of the webinar, Lucy is going to give us a clear view of what demand-side flexibility is. So go ahead, Lucy, you can share your screen now.
Certainly. Oh, can you see that?
Yes.
Perfect. In which case I will get started. So yes, thank you again for having me. And so this presentation will give a high-level overview of the demand-side flexibility market in Europe. Oh, sorry. There we go. I will start with a little introduction again about myself and the company I work for, Delta EE, before looking at the energy transition in general in Europe, then a bit more in detail about demand-side flexibility, and then finally a sort of summary and synopsis of how I think the market will be moving in years to come. So Delta EE as an organisation, as we've said previously, is based in Scotland in the UK. We're a research and consultancy business enabling our customers to transition from sort of older energy systems to new energy. This involves sort of innovative, low carbon, consumer-centric business models and ideas. All in all, we have 11 research services, as you see on your screen there, that cover a wide range of energy topics. And then we also have a bespoke consultancy line in addition to these. But the primary purpose of me talking to you today is about demand-side flexibility. So, what I keep saying old energy and new energy, so it's useful to give sort of a quick summary as to what I mean by that. On the left there, you have what we call old energy. It's where Europe started in the early 2000s and where some parts of the US and Japan are today, primarily dominated by large coal power plants and centralized energy systems, with a very top-down way of thinking about the energy system. It starts at the big transmission levels and you work your way down to the end consumer. However, nowadays we're moving to what we call new energy, and this is the emerging market in Europe at the moment. It is as much about the consumer side of the meter as it is the utility side. It's about data, connectivity, where energy flows don't just start from the top to the ground, they can go from the ground up. And it's about a mix of systems that sort of work together to create a more flexible, holistic energy system. Where that may all sound good, the key question in Europe is, that's great, but how do you make money out of it? Where is the value in this new energy world that we're in? The answer is that I will tell you in a moment. So to start with, this graph you see here highlights the energy transition that Europe is in and the world is in general. It shows renewable electricity generation as a percentage of total electricity generation. As you can see, some countries in Europe really do have a high penetration of renewable generation. I should also note this graph does include hydropower, which is why some of the Scandinavian countries are quite so high. They have very large resources of hydropower. A few key things to bring out of this graph. For example, Sweden, they plan by 2024 to have net zero carbon emissions. So that will mean increasing their renewable share again. And then the likes of Ireland, by 2030, they plan to have 70% of their electricity to come from renewable generations, which in their case is primarily wind, purely because unfortunately Europe is not quite as sunny as Mexico, but it's from an energy perspective, they are very similar, wind and PV. And next we have an illustration of the battery storage markets in Europe. Similarly to renewable generation, battery storages are increasing and they are expected to continue. At the moment, it is dominated by residential and front of meter assets, with a smaller portion being commercial and industrial, although we do expect all three of these portions to grow in the future. It's important when talking about batteries to realise that they enable renewable generation to enter the electricity grid and enables flexibility. If you have a industrial PV or wind or any non-flexible asset, if you add a battery to it, it enables flexibility from that asset, which is why they're such a key resource when we talk about flexibility and why it's a positive thing that they are becoming more popular across Europe. And then another graph that thankfully is a similar trajectory of positively growing into the future. This graph looks at electric vehicles. We have seen a massive growth in them recent years, and we expect that to continue. Between the years of 2015 and 2020, the number of electric vehicles increased by about 400,000. By 2030, we expect that to be about 40 million, which just highlights the scale of increase of electric vehicles. The good thing to note about electric vehicles is the social side of them, where it's good from a flexibility point of view. It also shows that across Europe, more people are willing to engage in the energy transition and do their bit towards renewable generation and increasing the use of that renewable generation. So it's good from an energy perspective, but it's also good from a wider society perspective as well. And then the final graph I have as an illustration here is connected home products. We at Delta EE refer to connected home products as assets that can be manipulated based on consumer demands and/or price signals from the energy market. Broadly, we are seeing a lot of engagement in the residential sector for connected home products, which is mirrored in C&I and larger scale assets as well. At the moment, across Europe broadly, about 10% of homeowners have some form of connected asset in their home. That could range from one of the little Alexa pods that you have, or something that attaches to your heating network that controls the comfort of your own home. The motivations around connected home products are very similar to the 3 graphs I've just shown you previously on batteries and electric vehicles. Consumers would like cheaper electricity bills, they want to be part of a green transition, and they want to increase the amount of renewables on the grid. And all 3 things I've just shown you are ways of doing that. Which leads me to this slide. This graph shows you, well, it's not a graph, sorry, it's an image, what we mean when we say sort of the electricity grid, consumption and production need to match. I'm sure you're all aware of that, but it's a core part of the electricity system. As globally more conventional energy resources are being reduced, Germany's removing their coal, France is removing their nuclear, and countries more globally want to increase their renewable generation, this pairing of consumption and production is becoming more important. And that's where demand side flexibility comes into it, to enable this complete balance of the electricity system. So I spoke about old energy and new energy, and these slides just highlight what we mean by flexibility and demand side flexibility in these areas. So in the old, more traditional energy sense, optimization or flexibility at a residential or household level would be very basic. It would be changing your energy consumption due to day and night electricity tariffs. So having a lower price for electricity at night and then a slightly higher one during the day. For your networks or your regional energy providers, that flexibility would mean you have a large coal power plant, and that will be used in an event of a blackout. If everyone turned on the same industry and all the houses turned on the lights at the same time, the coal power plant would be used to ensure that consumption and production was the same. And then thirdly, optimization of the electricity markets would be done again using these large conventional power plants. So that's old energy, but what you really want to know about is the new energy, the fun, new, innovative things that are going on at the moment. So again, to start from the top, household levels. As I just mentioned, day and night, that's becoming more complex. We are seeing homeowners and residential customers being exposed to wholesale prices in order to manipulate their behavior. That could also include self-consumption, where a homeowner consumes more of the generation that they generate potentially through solar PV on their roof. And then thirdly, they'll be able to minimize peak demand charges. And when I say peak demand charges, I mean those that you have to pay for use of a system. So every user of the electricity system pays a small charge to be able to use that. And in some markets, you are able to reduce that fee through flexibility. At the slightly larger level, the sort of regional and the networks level, you are seeing flexibility at the transmission, the distribution, and at times the local level. And this is a key shift that we're seeing in Europe at the moment, is flexibility across all 3 of these levels. The first step, say for Mexico, if you wanted to start flexibility, would be to start at the top. So start at the transmission network level and work your way down. It should be noted that where sort of distribution and local levels are active in Europe, it's still very early stages and very small commercial, but mostly trials. So always start at the top and then work your way down. And then for the third bit at the end about electricity markets, this is sort of the larger players thinking about how they can optimize based on wholesale prices. And again, going back to what I said about matching generation and supply, just always conscious that increased renewables and increased flexibility means you need to match those 2 things at a more minute basis and generally more frequently than you do with older systems. So that's quite a good overview, should I say, of the energy system and why we need flexibility. The key thing now is what is demand side flexibility? We at Delta EE define demand side flexibility as the utilization of any behind the meter asset that can be shifted up or down, on or off in response to a wider electricity signal. It's a price signal. These assets are technology agnostic. By that we mean we don't just say it has to be a battery or it has to be a PV or a wind turbine. If it can manipulate its load, it can be used as a flexible asset. Where you're likely to see price signals are from, say, your demand charges, as I mentioned previously, the transmission system operators, the electricity market, the people that do the wholesale prices, your capacity market, and then in Europe, it's just starting that we're doing distribution price signals. So on the one hand, you have an asset that can change its consumption or production, and on the other hand, you have a price signal that's asking it to do that. And that, in a nutshell, is what we mean by demand side flexibility. So how is this developing in Europe? This map comes from our market monitor that I will explain a little bit about at the end, but we looked at a high-level overview of 21 European countries. And what you can see here is high, medium, and low development of these countries. High being the most mature, the most open markets demand-side flexibility, and the lower ones being they have a demand-side flexibility market, but there's a lot of barriers and it's a newer market with less market participation. As you can see here, the key markets at the moment in Europe are GB, France, Germany, parts of the Nordics, Belgium. This, as you'll see in the subsequent graphs, is a trend across Europe. The darker orange colours you see here are the most developed markets. That's not to say they're the best markets or that they have no barriers to demand-side flexibility. They just have the least out of the major European countries at the moment. So arguably one of the more important slides here is how do you make money out of flexibility? There are 5 key areas in which people in Europe are doing that at the moment. I'll just sort of skim through left to right. On the left there, number 1, you have wholesale electricity markets. These are where assets are optimized based on the electricity price. That could be intraday or day ahead. Number 2, you have again what I said about the network charges. This can be transmission or distribution. So if you can provide a form of flexibility, at times you can reduce the amount of charge you have to pay. So it's a cost saving for you and your company. Thirdly, the ancillary services. These are by far the most dominant form of monetization at the moment. These are transmission system operator value streams, and they are there to enable this balance between production and consumption. As more of these sort of larger conventional power generation sources are coming offline and more renewables are coming in, these value streams are coming important in order to stabilize the grid, and therefore there is a reward, a monetary value in providing this service to your transmission system operator. The words you see on the screen there are the European generic terms, but they differ slightly in every country. And then fourthly, you have your capacity market. And this is to ensure that in the next 5-10 years, a country has enough generation capacity. Again, I do keep saying this, I'm sorry, that the generation's going, more renewables, but that means that the TSO needs reassurance that there's going to be enough generation to keep the lights on. So that's another form of value creation. And then finally, you have your DSO products. And this is a very small part of the market at the moment. The GB market's the only one where it's commercially active. So it's very small in Europe at the moment, but potentially in the long term, it could be somewhere that you would develop to after you've done the higher level transmission value streams. Sort of 1 to 4 first, and then 5 after that. So I've told you what demand side flexibility is and where it's most active. And now this slide highlights sort of who is active, what type of players. By far the most engaged players is your industrial customer. They have the least barriers. When we say industrial customers, that could be anything from a steel plant, a glass manufacturer, a range of assets, as long as they can turn up, turn down, or shift their load as per the demand side flexibility definition. Next, you have your commercial customers that are slightly smaller than your industrial ones. They are active, it's a growing market, but they at the moment have more barriers to entering this space, primarily kind of administrative barriers from regulators, and this can be quite costly if you're a smaller business. And these are barriers that the industrial customers don't necessarily have because they have more capital. And then finally, a much smaller scale, you have your residential assets. It's an interesting market and there's new innovative business models to get residential customers engaged. But relative to the commercial and industrial, certainly from a megawatt perspective, it's a lot lower, but still something we're keen to develop and look into, just not as big as industrial and commercial scales. And now another aspect that's interesting to consider is not only who's active, but what are they active using? What are their key assets? As you can see here, generation and industrial processes are by far the leading source or asset used in demand side flexibility. This is because they're generally the easiest, they have the lowest barriers, and they're also the most common at the moment. However, you've got battery storage there, HVAC, which is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, EVs, that is electric vehicles, and lighting, are all growing. The more demand side flexibility we have in Europe, the more markets that are open, the more we expect the bottom 3 there to grow. It's just sort of time, it will happen. The markets have just got to develop a little bit more in order for that to happen. And then the final slide for this section is just to highlight that where demand side flexibility in Europe is quite young, it's only about 10 years old, 15 years old at the maximum, it's still very competitive. In GB alone, there's sort of tens to hundreds of players. Europe more broadly, even more hundreds. Germany, you're talking sort of 900 players approximately because of all of their different segments they have. So it's a very competitive market. As the market's open, we only expect it to get more competitive with more players, increasing sort of innovative new business models to get those assets, to get those key customers engaged. So this is again something we as a company really look into, like who's doing what and where, and how is this going to change as the market develops. And so my last little section is just some summary points about what I've just said and sort of key to look forward to points, especially if you're in Mexico and you're trying to think of how you could develop a demand side flexibility market. So sort of number one is new energy is happening in Europe. It's definitely there. Everyone's talking about it, but really we're only just scratching the surface. There's so much more that we could do and we could learn and we could put more assets, more value streams, more business models. So yes, Europe is very developed in demand side flexibility. There's still a lot more we can do and we don't like to forget that. Number two, business as usual is no longer really an option in Europe. We find that the companies that not refuse, but are not as engaged in demand side flexibility are starting to come around and realize the benefits of it. And sometimes that does mean that another player's got in that space first. If they made the leap a couple of years earlier, it might be different. So we're definitely seeing that business as usual is no longer an option in Europe. With all this sort of new value streams, new assets, innovation is huge. We see so many more markets opening, new business models. It's every day I read the news and I see something new and different that's come up. And so we like to keep track of that. And it's also a way of engaging customers. There's no sort of one size fits all argument for demand side flexibility. It can change and will change depending on the market and the country that you're in. Number 4, it links to number 3 in the sense that for demand side flexibility to develop and become prominent, it needs innovation. It needs business leaders to think outside of the box and go, I see a need, I have a way of fixing that need, and almost take sort of the leap of faith. And then people will follow and regulation will come behind you as well. And then finally, we just expect it to grow. I mean, there's a lot of developments. We expect more players, more market streams, more business models. I know I've said that before. I do apologize, but I don't think we can stress enough how much the market's changing for the good. And if you asked me in 5 years' time, it'll have changed a lot for the better. So hopefully you ask me in 5 years' time and I'll tell you what's changed. But it's definitely a space to look out for. Oh, and one final thing that I thought would be beneficial to you all. On our website, we have a public version of the European Market Monitor, which is where some of the graphs I've been speaking to you about is on. So if you're interested more in this space, it's a good available resource for a bit more detail, and the maps are a good illustrative example of what's going on in Europe.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Lucy. That was an outstanding introduction to the subject. I've been reminded, I forgot to mention that we have the active translation services. Whoever is listening to us that wishes to hear us in Spanish, Zoom webinars have really thought of everything, and they have a small icon on the bottom portion of your screen. It says small little world in there. If you click on that button, you're going to hear us in Spanish. So very interesting subject. So I prepared a series of questions that could help us drive the concept home, particularly here in Mexico. So I'm thinking out loud here. I'm guessing a lot of the invites in the audience were realizing how different is not only our market on the private side, but also our policy making. So I would ask most generally, what are the main entrance barriers you perceive to unlock demand side flexibility? I mean, there's obviously, it's a very sophisticated concept. You need a lot of information. You need a lot of flexibility. So the actors, they become key players, and there's a certain cultural side to overcome. So what would you say? How do we get this going?
I think a key thing you said there was actors. Yes, there are technical barriers from a pure electricity system perspective of metering and data. And that is one key bucket that the engineers amongst us can solve. But the other sort of bucket is the actors, the players, the customer propositions. In order to have a developed market that will continue to grow, people need to want to be a part of it. And therefore you need clear, attractive customer propositions. So once you identify Mexico's needs specifically, it'll be a really good way of going. So I have an asset. Please tell me how I can use it, what value streams I can play into, and make it attractive for me as a customer. Something that I occasionally forget myself is I do this all day, every day. So I'm a bit of a nerd, but also I understand the systems, and therefore to make an attractive customer proposition to overcome these barriers, you need to sort of make it simple for the customer. You need to give them a nice offering that they understand, that's not overly technical or detailed, but a clear, simple understanding that will overcome sort of the knowledge barrier between the energy system and the asset owner or the industrial owner. So I think, yes, just to summarize in 2 points your answer. One is the technical, the metering, the data that's required. And the other one is getting the customers on board and explaining the need for flexibility.
Right. Well, I'm guessing part of the concept in DSF is not as new as we think. I'm guessing, for instance, time of use. It's a widely practiced standard here in Mexico. Industrial users are subject to time of use tariffs, and I'm guessing that sends a particular signal. That's something to start with, no?
Yes, no, that's a very good point. If you say industrial users in Mexico are already using it, then just sort of start a trickle down process to other users. As you say, it sends a clear signal to the industrial user as and when they should use their industry. And there's no reason why that can't be paired with demand side flexibility. Yeah.
Yes. So how can we get a sense of how widely practiced or mature is the demand side flexibility in a particular country? I just want to get a feel of how far behind are we in Mexico, really? And you shared a couple of slides about that. So what would you see on the grid or even in the consumer or end user level? What sort of behavioral changes do you tend to evaluate to judge that?
So from a consumer, let's maybe start with the consumer perspective. As you just said there, time of use tariffs is a good one for industrial, commercial, and residential scale assets. Engaging with data is another one. In Europe, there's this big drive that we have smart meters now, and in a lot of homes, there's a big rollout of them. So you can tell how much electricity you're using at any given time. And where that, for me, obviously, I'm a residential user myself, C&I and industrial have the same idea. So they have meter systems, they're aware of their data, they're aware of their consumption. And through that awareness, not only do you educate yourself, but you enable demand side flexibility. Because then you can see sort of the business cases of, oh, I own freezers, for example. I'm a supermarket owner and I have some freezers. You don't need to freeze them all at the same time 24/7. There may be periods of the night when you can drop just a little bit or just a bit more to an order flexibility, but in no way does it impact your core business. And through data, you can enable that and you can understand the business case. So yes, that's one aspect. And then the maturity, as you asked in the question, is just to look at the markets, see how many competitors there are, and see who's doing what is a really good indicator of the maturity of the market, is how many players are actively in the markets.
Interesting. So from the one part, there's the flows of information that they have to be openly shared throughout users, generators, and all the different actors involved. So we have this infrastructure, this data acquisition, which we can work with, right? And there's also how open is a certain market. I mean, that's becoming a bit of a political discussion, and we're going to have to dive ourselves into that conversation. But so assuming Europe is on the early stages of demand side flexibility, that would mean we in Mexico are still completely unfamiliar with the concept. We're in their infancy, let's say. In your own words, what would be the right triggers or behaviors we should look for to jumpstart this practice? For instance, the fact that we do not have we have the motion to close the market and reprioritize on a state-owned company. Does that present a threat at all in your own opinion?
I wouldn't say it presents a threat. I think Mexico is very much where, say, most of Europe was 10, 15 years ago, which you could take as a positive. You can leapfrog all the early mistakes that Europe made and just go to the good bits. But it also, the key triggers, I think, are not necessarily regulation and hard pushes, but innovation. For example, this webinar, if industry leaders and industry stakeholders realize the need for demand side flexibility and innovate, then regulation will feed in through. Europe, demand side flexibility started with a few core industries and companies, and only now, sort of this year, do we have the clean energy package from the European government to push forward demand side flexibility even more? So I would say, don't wait for regulation and then act. Europe, we acted and then regulation followed. So yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of specific loads or businesses that could particularly benefit on DSF. So what are the kind of business segments that could get the biggest benefit out of DSF and why?
I think a positive answer is any asset or industry that has a form of manipulation in their assets can participate, which is a good thing about demand side flexibility. It's not one single asset or industry. So any industry that can manipulate their loads is useful. The key ones that we're seeing in Europe at the moment are either the larger ones, just because it's easier to do everything at economies of scale. So the larger industries, primarily because if you do slight changes, it's not as noticeable if you have a larger generation and consumption portfolio. And then the other segment I would say is the faster ones. Without going into too much detail, largely the faster you can respond to price signals, the more value you get from it. So if you have an asset, for example, a battery that can respond very, very quickly, we're talking seconds to sub-second time, then that's a benefit for you and you will receive more value from it.
And what about the safety concept behind it? I mean, it's obviously this has a lot of cultural barriers, and for people to be able to trust the signals that are coming from the outside that could potentially affect their processes. How do you get to have a trustworthy infrastructure in place, and how all the people share, in that system?
I think first, from a technical perspective, the trust comes from the processes that you have in place, the physical barriers of hardware and software to enable you to understand where the loads are and to ensure that there is always enough electricity on the system, because you wouldn't want a blackout or a brownout. So from a technical perspective, there is lots of safeguards to ensure security of supply. From a more consumer perspective, the trust comes from industry and government and the TSOs working in collaboration. Most of the European TSOs don't make all these rules by themselves. They are obviously the governing body, but they do it in consultation with industry stakeholders, actors, players, whoever's in the market. And that ensures that not only does the TSO, the transmission system operator, get what they would like, but so does the market players, and everyone's on the same playing field and understand the rules and what's happening. I think that's the key thing, is collaboration between government and regulation and the bodies, and then players in the market.
And there's obviously a huge benefit behind that collaboration, even a monetary estimate of how much is being lost on a specific electric grid. I'm not sure we've quantified in Mexico what's the real loss, but I'm sure there's a huge opportunity there, and hence we can start somewhere. So go ahead.
No, you continue, sorry.
I was going to drive us towards the PV industry. How does PV technology enter the scene here? What does demand side flexibility mean for intermittent renewables on a utility scale format? What does it mean for PV users also on a CNI segment or a distributed generation segment?
I think the key point for PV at any scale, particularly the larger CNI and industrial scales, is that on its own, solar PV is not a flexible asset. It is a generation asset from the sun, generates electricity. That's not to say, however, it can't be used for demand side flexibility. It can, in two primary ways. One, you are a PV plant and you have excess generation. Another player on the market could increase their consumption to match your increase in generation. That will be done via a price signal from the market. So you are benefiting because you are getting paid to generate more, and the consumer is benefiting because they will be paying a reduced rate because they're consuming renewable generation. So it's a win-win for everyone in that sense. And the second way you can monetize it is generally through co-location of a storage asset, primarily batteries. This is becoming a more common practice in Europe at the moment. So essentially you have your PV farm and you have excess generation. Instead of that going straight onto the grid or potentially being turned off if there's too much generation on the grid already, you store it in a battery. And therefore it's stored, it's very useful, and you can discharge that battery back into the grid when it's most economical for you. So there will be price signals in the market that gets, we need more generation, and you will dispatch that from your battery that you've got the generation from your PV plant. So there are two main ways there of monetizing PV at any scale, but obviously also CNI and industrial.
Excellent. Well, that's very clear. So we're going to allow you to make to give us a foreign view of what you see in our policy making from abroad on your own perspective. What advice do you have for Mexican policymakers?
I think my key bit of advice would be to look at Mexico. I'm not an expert on the Mexican electricity system. However, from what I've learned in Europe, every country is slightly different. Where there are sort of overarching European goals and systems, the demand side flexibility in Ireland or Norway or Germany will all be slightly different because of their national and regional needs. So I think the first step would be to look at Mexico, see where the issues are. Are there areas of high demand, high constraint, issues on the network around your cities or your rural areas? So really dig deep to see where you can use demand side flexibility in Mexico, and then see about the business models and the customer propositions to fix those. So it has to, you can obviously take learnings from Europe, and I implore you to do that, the good and the not so good at times. So it's a good learning case, but take the ideas and then see how they match Mexico, because it's not a stamp. You can't just go, oh, this happened in Europe and put it in Mexico. It has to come from Mexico. But if you do that, it will work for Mexico and be very good, and you'll be able to benefit from it much more than if you try to directly take something from another country.
Right. Well, for what it's worth, from my chair, it all looks pretty positive on Europe. So I don't know. I would ask if there is any example on the internationally where we have a majority stake of a government-owned system, electricity system, or a state-owned, where there is, wherever there is a certain predominance of the state in the electricity market. Do we see DSF? Do we see a very innovative and efficient system? Do we have an example?
Do we have an example of state-owned demand-side flexibility? I think there's probably two prongs to that. You have the countries such as the UK, GB, that used to be state-owned, and parts of it still are, but they're migrating to more independent demand-side flexibility markets. Or then you've got sort of the Eastern European countries, Poland, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, who have predominantly state-owned generation plants, where they are perhaps not as developed as Western Europe. They're really starting to open their markets. They're trying to join some of the markets in Europe so they can benefit from it. So it's still state-owned, but they're starting to see the benefits of flexibility and see the value that you can gain from it. So they're a good, say, stepping stone between, say, Mexico and the more developed markets in Western Europe, as a maybe 5 years advance to Mexico, 10 years, rather than 15 to 20.
Great. So how how do you how do you size the market for DSF? How do you make the argument? Let's say we wanted to get our numbers right and go to a lot of policymakers and convince them of the fact that DSF needs to be promoted. And we're obviously lagging, but how could we build an estimate within our own grid?
So again, it would be similar to the previous question about looking at Mexico. Across Europe, for demand side flexibility, you're talking tens of gigawatts in size, so it is relatively large. But first, I'd look at the need in Mexico and then the assets that you have that are technically capable of providing flexibility. And if you sort of match those two together between the assets that can provide it and that the energy system needs, that will give you a good estimation of the size of the market. And then you can start to plan more detailed sort of value streams on top of that.
Right. So can you give us your own futuristic view for demand side implementation? Let's say in a particularly industrial, commercial, and the residential segment. What remarks or comments would you share based on the experience for each user?
Okay, I'll start with residential. I suspect in say 10, 15 years, it'll be data driven, saying that's for all residential, C&I and industrial, all of them will be data driven. For residential customers, I imagine that primarily being sort of cost saving, most likely through an application on your phone, for you to be able to visualize where your consumption is, where your generation is, when are you using electricity. So residential will be more data, although I don't think residential customers will have a direct connection to the electricity system, because as a residential customer, there's not the need or the engagement or the want to be that engaged in the electricity system. They want to be aware, but they don't want to have to change loads in their home depending on a price signal. That's a bit too detailed for a residential customer. That said, for a commercial and industrial customer, I think that is where we'll be moving to. Any customer on the C&I scale that can monetize an asset most likely will. So that will require more data, more technology, and also better software to enable them to do this, especially as you get to the larger sites or the sites with multiple loads. There will need to be more platforms, more software, more data visualization tools for C&I customers. So that's a whole other market segment, if you would like, connected to demand side flexibility. But overall in Europe, I would see if an asset is technically capable of providing flexibility, there will be a market for them to do that in. Depends on the asset, the market they play into, but the way the markets are opening and it's getting more and more accepted that larger loads can benefit from demand side flexibility, I think that's a key trend that we will be seeing in the next sort of 5 to 10 years.
That's very, very interesting. I mean, obviously there's this huge opportunity, recognizing what are the trends, the behavioral behind consumers. And I've been seeing a lot of trends that are sort of colliding itself, like Internet of Things, of course. Yes. We have Industry 4.0, where commercial and industrial users are starting to interact with the loads in specific manners. And then we have the electrification of the whole energy consumption. I mean, that's massive, right? Yeah. We are really pushing towards electrifying virtually everything. Transport being the next major wave that we're going to hit, right?
I completely agree. I think in a way it's a positive for the countries, Mexico included, that are not necessarily the most developed in demand side flexibility. All of this electrification, digitization through the Internet of Things, platforms, connectivity of data and assets, that's all going to be in your favor in increasing your ability to do demand side flexibility. In many ways, Europe had to start from scratch. I don't believe other countries and other regions of the world are going to have to do that. You've got almost a leg up through this societal acceptance of data and connectivity that can easily be used for demand side flexibility. Your smartphone is just as capable of enabling a residential customer to do flexibility than it was 10 years ago. And you already have that really good starting point that I think will help you in this journey to do demand side flexibility.
Right. So I'm guessing a lot of where you stand right now has to do with opening up and sharing information, having this infrastructure where different actors trust each other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we go 30 or 40 years up in time, do you believe we're ever going to be like one international grid? Do you believe like we're going to have the exchanges without frontiers between countries, and we're each going to have a particular footprint, energy footprint, and will we ever get there?
It's an interesting question that occasionally it does get brought up in the idea of like a pan-global electricity system. Due to geography, I don't think that's going to happen just because it's not necessarily feasible to connect the west coast of Europe with America. There's an ocean in the middle. However, I do think there's going to be a global drive towards flexibility. Mexico and America could theoretically share electricity the same way Europe does. So I think there will be pockets of interconnectivity, sort of maybe one in Asia, Europe, the American continent, maybe one in South America as well, that allows more connectivity. Another thing that's important to note with flexibility, that it is very local, where you can have the large scale barriers for regions, say Mexico, Europe, America, New Zealand, wherever really. It's very local. One area of Mexico may have a different need to another, rural versus urban, densely populated, not densely populated. So yes, I think it'd be great if we had a global consensus on demand side flexibility and what we would like to achieve with it. On the practical day-to-day development of it, I think that would have to be a bit more granular and regional, at least.
Right. So Mexico has had its share of debate this year, COVID, that made us pushed about a 13% drop on the electricity demand within COVID months of April and May. So there was an ongoing discussion whether grid stability should deprioritize variable renewable energy sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have all this talk about curtailment. And of course, in California, since we're somewhat close to that market and it's so sophisticated, I mean, they've been talking about the duck curve and how to mitigate that. And we're obviously very, very far off from where they are. But what would you say, generally speaking, about all these debate about when should renewable energies become a threat to the stability of the grid? What would you say there?
I think overarchingly, renewable generation is not a threat to the grid. I mean, there are some countries in Europe that are aiming for 70, 90, 100% renewable generation. It's not necessarily easy, but it is doable. We had, I'm sure, a similar conversation in Europe over the impacts of COVID and what that did to our electricity demand. Obviously reduced quite a lot during the peak periods of lockdown. But subsequently, a lot of European countries have incentivized demand side flexibility more so in order to combat that. We've seen it as a key driver, in fact, in Europe as to why we should have demand side flexibility. It's highlighted potential issues and volatilities in the network, and now we're making steps in order to improve that and to stop that happening in the future. If an event, hopefully not COVID again, but a similar electricity event were to happen in the future, I think renewables cause you to rethink your electricity system. we've obviously all had a very stable top-down system for decades. So it does require a change, but I don't necessarily think that should be a change to run away from or to not approach. Because at the end of the day, renewables is decarbonisation, which I like to think we all agree is a positive thing and something we need to do for everyone.
Well, of course. So before we end our session today, we have the smart charging capabilities on vehicles, and that presents like a very, very interesting subject for demand side flexibility, right? An electric vehicle that could act as a load as well as a generator, and particularly there, what comes first? Innovation, technology, and then the public policy behind it, or is it the other way around? That technology particularly sounds so feasible, so disruptive. Do we have any cases in Europe where this is actually becoming mainstream or is ramping up?
It's interesting you should ask that, because I think that's almost the bit that we're at, especially in the UK at the moment and Europe more widely, is this vehicle to grid electric vehicle charging. That's really what we're trying to get our teeth into at the moment. The acceleration of electric vehicles has been increased through incentives of the government, specifically the UK. They're giving people money essentially to buy an electric vehicle, make it cheaper for them. So that's a driver, obviously. But before that happened, the car manufacturing industry throughout Europe started making better electric vehicles that had longer distances, that were more technologically advanced, and more people brought them, which therefore made government realize it was a good thing, so they put the incentives in. So it's a bit of both. If you have the technology, people will buy it, and then the governments help even more people buy it, and it sort of goes like that for a little bit until it's completely commercial, and then the governments can step back, and it's just a market as you would have anything else. But it's definitely EV charging is sort of the really new thing at the moment in Europe, and definitely something to keep your eye on.
Great. So if you're okay with that, we're going to go search for a couple of questions from our audience. I would like to remind everyone, if there's something that you would like to ask, now's the time. So Hector Curiel asks, Lucinda, you're focusing with good reason on the European markets. Isn't this demand somehow inescapable due to government-imposed policies? What would it take for developing economies to attain similar demand levels?
So from what I understand, that question means essentially like the reason we have demand side flexibility in Europe is because government has imposed it on players. Is that a correct understanding, would you say?
But I believe he's assuming that that's the situation. Is that correct? Is that imposition a right assumption?
I think to a degree, yes. There are clear government incentives in some cases, which are so there are government incentives, but I think primarily the drivers coming from the market players. A lot of my work includes talking to stakeholders, to aggregators, to people who are participating in demand side flexibility. And more often than not, they're telling me that there are government barriers. There are key things the government haven't removed yet to enable them to do their job. And therefore, they're trying to talk to the governments, to talk to the transmission operators to remove these barriers. So in one hand, the markets are there to enable demand side flexibility. You have the value stream, as the question suggests. European markets are open in that sense, but there also are quite a lot of barriers that players are trying to remove in order to make the market better for themselves. In terms of what would it take for a developing economy to do a similar thing, I would go back to the innovation. If you can identify the core needs in the Mexican market and a way to fix those needs, that's what you really need. You also need the answer to the question, and then regulation and everything else will come in behind that once you've got the need and the ability to fix it.
Right. We have another question, Andres Garcia. He's asking whether in Germany there was a major wind capacity decommission. I don't know what you make of that question. Did Germany had a big decommissioning of wind infrastructure?
I'm not personally aware at the moment of a large decommissioning of wind in Germany. I could be wrong, so that's always something I can go away and have a look at. I'm aware in Germany they're removing a lot of their coal power plants in order to make way for renewables. But something in Germany that's also important to remember is, in terms of especially wind generation, they're really quite developed and they've been doing it for 20 years, almost 30 years. They were almost a pioneer in wind development. So it could be possible that in this case it was just an older wind farm that they've decommissioned to make way for a more efficient one. I cannot say that for certain, but the overall trend in Germany is to not decommission renewables. It's to incentivize them and allow them to generate.
Of course. So we have reached the end of today's session. I mean, this is a very, very interesting subject. I would encourage everyone to get familiar with the Delta EE, what they do. There's a couple of reports that are also available, as she mentioned. I would also add that IRENA, they have a very interesting report as well that was published in 2019. I came across that document on their website. It's called Demand Side Flexibility Report.
It's a very good one.
It's a very good one. There's not all of the information on the web, so we would encourage everyone to keep on researching this interesting subject. So, Lucy, this has been very instructive. On behalf of our own professional community, I thank you so much. So
thank you for having me. It's been very enjoyable.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is where you would receive a standing ovation, right? Where these are live audience. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to place these. I'm going to place on the screen information from our association in case anyone is interested in becoming a member. Thank you very much, Lucy. It's lunchtime for us. It's supper time for you. Thank you very much for the effort.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Les invitamos a nuestro próximo webinar, el próximo jueves 10 de diciembre. Estén atentos a la invitación. La importancia del recurso solar y de la información meteorológica en la construcción y operación de proyectos solares. Bienvenidos.